Brother RC here. So random theology, another installment. So this time I just want to have my initial reactions to the Gavin Ortlund versus Ryan Mullins debate on Idol Killer, his YouTube channel. They just had it, and they had it on April the 18th, 2024. So I just wanted to give you my initial reaction to it. The debate, it centered much on the definition of divine simplicity. And the interesting part of this debate was they released their opening statements a week in advance and then went into attempting to still man each other's viewpoint. So Gavin Ortlund attempted to defend the idea that divine simplicity is false, whereas Ryan Mullins defended the view that divine simplicity was true and tried to still man each other's perspectives, and then went into a 30-minute dialogue between each other. The debate topics centered on church history, and then it went into the biblical evidence for divine simplicity, and then went into the charge of it being incoherent. So dealing with the logical ramifications of divine simplicity and really emphasizing the definition of divine simplicity and whether or not the definition is coherent. Is the concept of divine simplicity coherent? So focusing first on Gavin Ortlund's, his contribution to this debate. So he really emphasized that the church fathers, in his view, were anonymous in their consensus of accepting divine simplicity. And then his further argument was that it is going to be the best way to preserve divine aseity and monotheism, whereas R.T. Mullins, he was arguing, well, yeah, there may have been a universal acceptance among some of the church fathers, but you see a diversity. And on R.T. Mullins' view, in Dr. Mullins' perspective versus Dr. Ortlund, Dr. Mullins saw that you look at throughout all of the different traditions, there's not this immediate embrace of divine simplicity. You look at Islamic philosophers like Al-Ghazali, or you look at Hindu philosophers, there is not this universal acceptance. And then when you look at the church fathers, for Dr. Mullins, he sees Gregory Palamas and John Duns Scotus as not embracing a full-fledged divine simplicity. And also Gregory Nazianzus or Gregory Nyssa, at least when their embrace of seems like they embrace an essence energy distinction, right? And so we'll have to unpack all of that, but both of them were. So the appeal to the church fathers is merely to caution us in whether we should embrace or discard divine simplicity. But moving on to the actual debate in terms of the coherence of divine simplicity, Gavin Ortlund, Dr. Ortlund, was saying that Dr. Mullins is caricaturing divine simplicity because he's only focusing on the Thomistic conception of divine simplicity. And so he may be able to, his logical arguments may be successful to demonstrate that the Augustinian, Anselmian, Aquinian view is false, that it's incoherent, but it doesn't demonstrate that all the other views are false. It doesn't demonstrate that Gregory Palamas, his view, the essence-energy distinction, and John Duns Scotus's distinction with the formal distinction and the unitative unity, right? That there's more than one perspective. There's a spectrum of views, and that's what Gavin Ortlund, at least that was my impression of what he was arguing. So let's focus on the definition. So they both articulated divine simplicity as the affirmation or denial, depending upon how you want to articulate it, is that God is without parts. That all that is in God is God, and that God lacks parts. God lacks physical parts, temporal parts, metaphysical parts, logical parts. So God is without them, right? So all that is in God is God. And that what was interesting about this debate is, so Gavin is very clear that God has no intrinsic, numerically distinct attributes, right? But he wants to say that there is a modification of the substance, that the Trinity can be consistent with divine simplicity in its various forms, on his view. And so Dr. Mullins, he argues that divine simplicity is unbiblical, that the concept is incoherent, and it is inconsistent with the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of the Incarnation. And Gavin Ortlund was arguing, well, divine simplicity, it is fruitful because it preserves divine aseity. It preserves a robust understanding of monotheism against tritheism and other heresies. And it is helpful addressing the Euthyphro dilemma. So let's get into some of these topics here. So my immediate reaction was that they didn't get into the actual metaphysics deeply. I know that Dr. Mullins did get into it when he was attempting to steelman Dr. Ortlund's view. He articulated a dependence argument, so that if you assume divine simplicity, then God does not operate through his divine attributes, because he is identical to his attributes, right? And so you don't have any hint of God participating in something that transcends God. God doesn't participate in an attribute that he possesses. Rather, God is identical to his attributes. And that's good. That's all well and good. So it's a metaphysical foundationalism that can be articulated within the assumption of divine simplicity, to show that God is a necessary being and that he is independent. He is not dependent upon any parts or propositions or properties, right? And so that's an interesting argument. I want to explore that further, but Gavin Ortlund said that that was a caricature, or that doesn't represent fully his view, which I find that odd. But, and then another point that was made was in the debate, Dr. Ortlund, he said that Dr. Mullins' attempted steelman was a caricature of sorts. And more could be said on, well, let me try to articulate something that struck me. So the first thing I want to say in reference to the argument that Dr. Mullins tried to steelman is that possession of a property is not the same as participation in a property, right? that's assuming some type of Platonic, if you think that God participates, that's some type of Platonic metaphysical viewpoint that isn't restricted to God, but rather God participates in something that transcends God, right? And we can have a metaphysic where God's attributes are numerically distinct and God possesses them. God is the property bearer of his attributes, or you could say the attribute bearer. God is the attribute bearer. So if we use a substance attribute distinction, the divine substance possesses the attributes, but doesn't participate in the attributes. And God is the explanation of his attributes. So the causal dependence relation would be asymmetrical, where the divine substance would ground the divine attributes. And the reason why they're divine attributes is precisely because the divine substance is the one that possesses it. And this would be intrinsic, right? This would be an intrinsic, not extrinsic to who and what God is, because God's divine attributes would be included in the real definition, the non-modal essential definition of God. So we cannot, even though the divine attributes would be numerically distinct from the divine substance, they would still be divine attributes precisely because God is the one that possesses them. The divine substance possesses the attributes, therefore they are divine, right? And we would say that they're uncreated, right? Which leads to the next discussion was, can God have contingent properties? Can God have divine properties that are contingent, that are created, right? Or uncreated? And the answer with this scheme, that would be possible. Whereas what Gavin Ortlund is saying is, well, no, it's not going to be possible because they wouldn't be divine, right? Because if I understand Gavin Ortlund's view, he is trying to use an essence-energy distinction. But the problem is he's trying to say that the divine substance, he produces these add extra divine attributes, right? And so then are they truly God, right? Are they just God's works, or are they in fact God himself? And with divine simplicity, he could say, well, God's works and God's acts or God's works are numerically identical to God's substance, God's essence, God's energy. So in that sense, God's essence and God's energies would be numerically identical for him, I guess, right? Or would they not be? Because if I understand the essence-energy distinction, if that's what Dr. Ortlund is trying to use, they're not numerically identical. They're distinct. They're numerically distinct, if I understand the distinction better. But I mean, David Bradshaw is going to be the one to look into that for the essence-energy distinction, and looking at his work on, I think it's East to Aristotle or something, or Aristotle to the East, right? But God's work is not numerically identical to God's essence, right? Because then you can end up with either pantheism or panentheism. So it's unclear how Dr. Ortlund can say that God can take upon contingent properties, that he can have Cambridge properties. Because if God can have Cambridge properties, well, it would seem like there would be a temporal, there would be some sort of temporal succession there. And if there's no temporal succession, well, then God would, I don't see how that would work. Even with mixed relations, I understand that mixed relations is intended to say that there is no dependence relation between God and his creation. The creature and the creator are completely distinct, and that there is no interdependence or dependence relation. There's no mutual dependence relation. And I would agree there is no mutual dependence relation unless God takes one on voluntarily, right? Which that would be something that would be up for debate. But here, assuming mixed relations, that there's an asymmetrical relation in which God grounds the universe and God affects the universe, but the universe the creation does not affect God. In that framework, the creation continues to change, right? It goes through motion, it goes through movement, it goes through change, whereas God would remain unchanging. But how would that be if Cambridge properties take place? If God can take upon Cambridge properties, well then when the universe or the world or creation changes, God's relation to the world would also change. And yeah, you can say God essentially isn't changing, but God's taking on extrinsic change. And I don't see how that would not entail some type of temporal succession. And then going on further with that thought, so Gavin says that God can have Cambridge properties, that God can take upon contingent attributes or properties. And he articulates this in terms of, well, they're ad extra. They're not, they're on the creature side, not the creator side. But then the question would be, well, then how are they God's attributes then? You know, when God demonstrates God's wrath, usually wrath is articulated as God's justice as it encounters sin, right? But it's contingent upon the sin. And so how can that be articulated? Now, what you could say is, well, God is causally the one that is active at causing the sin and causing his response to the sin. But in that case, then, does that, unless you want to embrace some type of occasionalism, because I know that Matthew W. Grant, he argues for a dual causation where humans have libertarian freedom, right? And he's going to affirm divine simplicity, and he's going to have to articulate this, but it's going to be difficult to articulate that without it lapsing into occasionalism, right? You have to have some conservationism or some type of concurrence, and it's going to be difficult to understand how that would play out without there being, unless you're saying that God causes you'd have to be saying God causes his Cambridge properties, the Cambridge changes, and therefore God is the cause of them. But that still seems to entail some type of succession, some temporal succession. And it's difficult to see how that would map on to divine simplicity. So there's just a host of problems with affirming divine simplicity and also affirming that you can have Cambridge changes and that you can have some sort of essence energy distinction without articulating how that works itself out, right? Often people will just appeal to mystery, that yes, God's attributes from our perspective are distinct, but from God's perspective, they're not. But then in that case, God's attributes are merely epistemic. They're not ontological. They're not metaphysical. There is no true metaphysical distinction to God's attributes. They're merely epistemically distinct. And so, in other words, there's just a conceptual distinction. There is no metaphysical distinction of attributes within God, right? And that is the core claim of divine simplicity, that all that we see are God's works or God's creation that reveals who and what God is. But that epistemic knowledge or understanding of who God is just merely the divine essence. And so you kind of have a Kantian phenomenal noumenal distinction here, right? Where they don't map together. And this is kind of like Karl Rahner's rule, where, the economic and ontological, they're not identical, right? So the economic, God's manifestation, what appears to us as God's attributes, they don't map onto reality in God. They only map onto God in God just as God himself, but they're not distinct from God, right? In any robust sense, right? Which brings me to the point that, so Dr. Gavin Ortlund was saying that, well, John Duns Scotus, his view is divine simplicity. But if you read Thomas Williams and Jeffrey Steele's paper on John Duns Scotus, and if you looked at John Duns Scotus's some of the work that's done by the Scotus scholars like Stephen Dumont and Penege, I forget his name, or Garrett Smith and others, or Richard Cross. But look at the primary sources. It's even with Marilyn Adams and Robert Adams, some of their views on how to understand Scotus. In my view, Scotus is saying something different than Aquinas. He is saying there's no composition in God. That's true. But his understanding of a part or composition is different than Aquinas. For Scotus, composition is separability, a real distinction within God. The idea that the divine essence or the divine substance and the divine attributes, if they're separable, then the attributes are treated as parts, right? But for Scotus, you have being, right? So being is taken as primary. And then before analyzing being is divided between infinite being and finite being. And only God is infinite being. And God as infinite being created all finite being, right? So you immediately have a creator-creature distinction within Scotus. But you also have some sort of univocity as well, because there is being, right? So there's some sort of univocity, but it's clearly there are two different modes of being. You have infinite being and you have finite being. And the infinite being, the divine substance, created all the finite beings, right? And then Scotus continues and he articulates this formal distinction in which within God, there is the divine substance, and the divine substance has divine attributes. And these divine attributes are numerically distinct. And so there's both identity and non-identity in Scotus's formal distinction. And it's intrinsic. It's ad intra, not ad extra. The way I understand it is that for Scotus, God's divine attributes, they're all infinite. God's divine substance is infinite. God's divine attributes are infinite. And God's divine substance is the ground or the explanation for God's numerically distinct divine attributes. And they are, using more contemporary metaphysical language, the divine substance is the attribute bearer. God possesses his attributes, and they are his. And God is the ground. So in terms of mereology, for Scotus, they're not parts. God's attributes are not parts because they're inseparable and they're indivisible. But in some sense, God is complex. God is not simple because God's divine attributes are not numerically identical to the divine substance. But they're unitatively one. So there's divine unity. The divine substance grounds the divine attributes, and there is unitatively containment. So they're unitatively contained by God. And therefore there's unity. And if we were to use mereological language, it seems that these attributes, obviously they're uncreated, and God is the ground of them. God doesn't participate in some transcendent Platonic realm. Rather, God possesses his divine attributes. They're uncreated, and there's nothing above and beyond God, and there's nothing above and beyond the divine substance. There's nothing above and beyond the divine attributes. And if I understand Scotus's view, there is both identity and non-identity within God. And I know that J.T. Passage, he has a paper where he talks about fusion, and that these divine attributes, there's some type of fusion within God. But so God is a complex being without composition. And the reason why for Scotus is because composition entails separability. And God's attributes are inseparable from the divine essence or the divine substance. And therefore, there is no composition, but there is certainly complexity. So if you want to look further, look at Jeffrey Steele and Thomas Williams' paper on divine Scotus's view. But also you could look at Stephen Dumont on the formal distinction. And this is why God's attributes are formally distinct. They're objectively distinct within God. There is an extramental distinction within God between his attributes. And this would probably, and that's why they're not treated as parts, right? God's attributes are not treated as parts. Because a part for Scotus is separability. They would be able to separate and decompose. Or, yeah, and that's impossible for God. That is metaphysically impossible. And in terms of like metaphysical foundationalism, you could think of this where the divine substance is the ground for all of the divine attributes, all of the distinct divine attributes. And so God is the asymmetrical explanation for all of God's attributes. So the divine substance is fundamental, which asymmetrically grounds or explains the divine attributes and the divine, you can go further with this. And this would be consistent with more contemporary work on the matter. So look at Paul M. Gould's work. He has this 4 views on Christian metaphysics, in which he articulates a similar view, right? And then also his upcoming paper, I think it was just recently released, on the title of the paper is In Defense of Christian Platonism. And it's in the book Ontology of Divinity, and it is published by De Gruyter, and the editor is Sijuwade. And he's defending a modified theistic activism. And I'll just give you kind of some quick things to say here on this paper. So Dr. Gould argues that God does not depend on anything distinct from himself for his existing, and everything distinct from God depends on God for its existing. And God is the creator and sustainer of the universe, and is ontologically distinct from the universe, yet present and active in the universe. The universe points beyond itself to the sacred order. And then Dr. Gould argues that he has a sacramental ontology. And he says, he defends that some abstract objects are in God as constituents of the divine substance. These abstract objects include God's essential properties as well as concepts identified with divine ideas and propositions, identified as divine thoughts. God's essential properties exist as uncreated constituents of the divine substance, whereas God's thoughts and ideas, propositions, and concepts are created by God via divine intellectual activity. So some of the abstract objects consist of all distinct, so think of Platonic realm, the divine substance creates the domain of abstract objects that consist of all the distinct from God properties and relations. The abstract objects belonging to this distinct realm from God, the God realm of abstract objects, call it Plato's heaven, are created by God via the divine volitional activity. Dr. Gould argues for metaphysical foundationalism. God is the metaphysical foundation to all reality. When creating the world, God creates 3 fundamental or ungrounded, relative to the created world, entities: substances, properties, and meanings, which he articulates as concepts and propositions. Dr. Gould argues for substantial priority. Substances are fundamental unities of parts, properties, and powers ordered for the sake of the entity's proper functioning. A substance, and so he takes up a substance attribute framework from Aristotle and causal pluralism, right? A substance is a fundamental whole that is metaphysically prior to its non-separable physical and or metaphysical parts. The universe is understood as a plurality of finite created substances organized hierarchically along the great chain of being. So he argues for a chain of being, an analogia entis, right? Ordered with respect to causal power profiles. Regarding the divine substance, God is a fundamental whole that is metaphysically prior to its properties, parts, and powers. And he goes in, a substance's essential and accidental properties are distinct from and flow from its nature. Regarding the divine substance, God's essential properties metaphysically depend on God, although given causal pluralism, there is a hierarchy of metaphysical dependency relations found within the divine substance. And he's going to argue from a non-modal essentialism, Dr. Gould will, to be able to get out of a bootstrapping objection and to argue against a vicious circularity or a vicious dependency, right? So you want to look at this paper because it's going to show that you can have, you can deny divine simplicity and have divine aseity, and it would be robust, right? So look at that, those two works. But so, and think of Ross Inman's work as well on neo-Aristotelian substances and fundamentality. So God has taken as the fundamental substance, the divine substance, that grounds his divine attributes. And whether you articulate this as an improper part or a proper part, you can still have the whole grounding the parts, right? And look at Gregory Fowler's paper, Simplicity, or I think it's Priority or Simplicity. And then, so Gregory Fowler, Matthew Baddendorf, his paper on divine aseity and divine simplicity. And then Alan Gearing, he has a paper on truth maker theory and divine simplicity. And I think that was published in Philosophia Christi, I think in 2011 or something like that. And then more recent work, you want to look at The Flexibility of Divine Simplicity by Mark K. Spencer. And then his most recent paper with Matthew Kirby, The One Has the Many, a further synthesis of Aquinas, Scotus, and Palamas. So you're going to look at all those papers and see that they are quite diverse in terms of what divine simplicity is, right? So divine simplicity, you have to articulate what is a part, right? And if God has parts, would that undermine divine aseity? Would that undermine? I think it's going to have. If you look at Chad McIntosh's work, because he has a paper on must God exist, and in that paper he shows that by rejecting divine simplicity, you have greater explanatory power and scope in terms of metaphysical explanation. People typically try to use divine simplicity as a stopping point for explanation, whereas what Chad McIntosh is arguing is that if you deny divine simplicity, actually you have greater explanatory power and scope than if you use it. And so that's an interesting point, that you can have greater metaphysical explanatory power and scope denying divine simplicity than affirming it. And I know that with non-modal essentialism, it's like epistemic foundationalism, where you can get out of bootstrapping, you could get out of circularity, and I mean, it's like non-modal essentialism takes axioms that which is going to be the essence, right? The real definitions of an essence, or real propositions, and it allows you to get out of any type of metaphysical bootstrapping. And so I think that's going to be, it's going to be related to this debate, right? So there was so much more that needed to be said in this debate. The consensus, I think it's wise to hear the patristics on what they affirmed. I know Andrew Gallowitz's work, and then I think Christopher Stead, his work. I think he has a book called Divine Substance, I think published in like 1977 or something like that. All of those works are going to be helpful to articulating the Church Fathers, but the Church Fathers, there is a diversity of views, and that's what Gavin or Dr. Ortlund was arguing for. And so that, if we embrace one of these views, well, then we affirm divine simplicity. But Dr. Mullins was saying, well, no, those are not consistent conceptions of divine simplicity. So now we want to get to one of the points that I found intriguing, is that Dr. Ortlund is saying that, we can have divine simplicity with the doctrine of the Trinity. And what was interesting about that is he was attempting to articulate some form of relative identity, right? And that's interesting, because if you embrace something that is, if you can have relative identity in the Trinity, well, then why can't you have some sort of relative propertyhood where you could say that the divine attributes don't count as properties, right? So you can take relative identity and apply it to the divine essence and say, well, yeah, God's attributes are numerically distinct from the divine essence, but they're still divine, given, and yet they're one, given relative identity, right? So you can use relative identity and still say that you affirm divine simplicity and not. So relative identity is not going to help you. I thought that was humorous. But then also some discussions that didn't come up is, does structure intrinsic to God entail a denial of divine simplicity? Because the divine processions has a taxis where the Father eternally begets the Son, and the Father and the Son, if you affirm the filioque, eternally begets, or spirates, I should say, the Holy Spirit. And in metaphysical language, this would be either a grounding relation or a causal relation, right? An explanatory relation. And I think I've said this in the past, but I think that Mark Macon at Biola, Dr. Macon's view of the divine processions is coherent. So essential dependence is how we want to articulate the divine processions. And I think we should affirm it. It provides further explanatory power and scope. But be that as it may, I think that if there's structure within God, then doesn't that entail some sort of complexity? But I would resist the idea that it's composition, because I think Scotus is right that composition, if we understand it in terms of separability, well, then we would preclude any type of composition within God. Although we would say that God is complex, right? So that seems right. And God would not be dependent upon some sort of abstract objects that transcend who and what God is, right? We've already said that. And I know the Church Fathers understood God as an immanent universal, right? But it's this idea that God is there is nothing that transcends who and what God is. God does not participate in anything above God. God possesses his attributes necessarily, and God's attributes are uncreated, and they are essential, and they are inseparable, right? and indivisible. They can't be divided up. And when you take that perspective, God does not participate in anything that is only, God is the foundation of all of reality, and all abstract objects are grounded in God. So then what we would end up saying is all that is in God, or all that God possesses, ad intra, not ad extra. In other words, if God is a property bearer or God is an attribute bearer, those attributes are divine attributes, and all that is in God, and all that God possesses or eternally produces, right? You think of the eternal processions. The eternal processions is understood as a productive understanding, right? So if you say all that God intrinsically possesses and all that God intrinsically produces, right, is God, right? So what that would capture is God's properties that God, or I should say God's attributes, God's divine attributes that he possesses that belong to God. Those would be divine attributes, and God would be the whole, right? The divine substance unitatively contains all of God's divine attributes, right? The whole would be God, right? And is this the equivalent of like identity as composition? And we'd have to say no, because composition would be understood as separability on this schema, right? And so no, right? It wouldn't quite be that. It wouldn't fit the picture. But yeah, so that's interesting to articulate it that way. So God would be identical with the divine substance, grounding the divine attributes. So all that is intrinsic, and so intrinsicality would be more than just numerical identity. It would be also property or attribute bearing, right? So God as the substance that grounds and possesses the attributes, right? And so those attributes would be divine. The attributes that God possesses would be divine. And so what would numerically be identical to God would be God as the whole, the substance and the attributes. So the whole grounds the parts, if we want to use the mereological language, but the whole, the substance and the attributes are grounded. So I should say it this way: the divine attributes are grounded by the divine substance, and the whole grounds the parts, if we're using mereological language. But again, we would say that there are no parts, because parts, if we're following Scotus, entails separability, which is metaphysically impossible in the case of God, because all of God's uncreated attributes are necessary. They're metaphysically necessary. They're logical necessary, right? The divine substance is necessary. And then with divine essential, or with non-modal essentialism, you can look at Joshua Sijuwade's paper elucidating divine identity, and look at the work of Paul M. Gould using Kit Fine's work, right? But what would be the real definition of God would be a tripersonal being of the divine kind, right? Or something like that. And included in the divine kind would be, in my understanding, which would be intrinsic to that, would, for a divine kind, would be necessary existence, and I guess it would be a primitive, right? Necessary existence, and a lot of the omni attributes. But then again, sometimes this is articulated in terms of propositions, and so you'd be able to articulate it with propositions as well to include. But God is the most perfect being, And so all of God's divine perfections would be included and entailed in that definition of God being the most perfect being, right? But that's for a different discussion. So my reaction would be that the definition of divine, the definition of the divine simplicity, it seemed like we weren't able to successfully disambiguate the definition of it because we have competing definitions between Dr. Ortlund and Dr. Mullins. But how does the divine Trinity, how can you have divine simplicity and the divine Trinity? Because given transitivity and symmetry with logic, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you'd end up with modalism, right? You would end up with modalism. But when you look at the philosophical literature on, for example, relations or substances, you can have a modification of a substance. Think of Spinoza. Spinoza believed that everything was divine. You read through his Ethics, and Spinoza thought that all of reality, all of the distinctions within the world are modes of the divine, right? For him, it's basically pantheism, but he would say that we're all modes. We're all modes, but modes is typically taken as like an aspect, right? Which is like an improper part. But if it's an improper part, is that sufficient enough for there to be personal identity, right? And I still wonder, given the divine processions, you have to have a grounding relation, right? You have to have essential and real definitions, right? They're going to be, look at Mark Macon's work. So you're going to have something more robust than just an improper part or an aspect. I don't think an aspect has enough weight to it. You need something more than that to be able to articulate a personal identity distinction, an I-thou relation, right? Even classical conciliar Trinitarianism is going to say that there's an I-thou relation between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The three persons, they're not the same person, right? And you don't have to take this understood in terms of, consciousness, right? Streams of consciousness. You can articulate this in terms of personal identity, right? The Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit have distinct personal identities. And how those identities are grounded, they're typically grounded in terms of the relations of origin, but the relations of origin, that entails a structure. That entails a taxis. And that taxis is intrinsic to God. It's not merely opposing relations within God, because even if you say that, that's fine. Subsistent relations with, paternity, filiation, spiration, those are ontologically grounded in the divine being. And the divine being, those have to have metaphysical weight to them. And that's either a causal relations, or, J.T. Passage, he says that they're productive relations. And so you have, the Father eternally producing the Son, and the Father and the Son eternally producing the Holy Spirit. And that's how you articulate the processions. But that would mean that you would see within God, there's this intrinsic distinct relations within God, right? And those relations are metaphysical. And so they're extramental. And so that would entail structure, and structure which obviously is caused by God, right? Which would mean that there is complexity there. Now, I know the argument that's used, and I want to just pull it up because Ross Inman, he uses it. And I just want to go through this argument, if I may. So the argument is something like this. Let me see if I have it here. Pardon me, I have the argument here. Let's go through it. It's actually on my, let me see here. So here's the argument. So let's go through it quickly here. So the argument is something like this, and I'll articulate this in terms of premises. Let's see here. Let's see. I apologize. I don't have it up right away, so let's pull it up here. Okay. There we go. All right, so premise 1, God is ase. Premise 2, whatever is ase cannot be dependent in any way. Premise 3, whatever exhibits C structure is dependent, and C structure would be C structure 1, part whole structure, C structure 2, substance accident, C3, nature and supposition, C4, essence, existence, and then C5, I would put structure, system or structure, right? All right, so, and then premise 4, whatever exhibits C structure cannot be ase. Conclusion, God cannot exhibit C structure for any, God cannot exhibit C structure of any kind. So this argument, it's supposed to show that God is identical to all that God is intrinsically, right? So God cannot have any C, God cannot exhibit any C structures, right? And C structure, C just stands for composition, right? So part whole structure, substance accident structure, nature supposition structure, essence existence structure, and then I put in structure system, structure or system. All right, so, and I believe what I've articulated would be able to, we can affirm that God is ase, but deny that God cannot exhibit any C structure, or that God, so premise 3 is going to be where we're going to attack it, and premise 2, because premise 3 is going to be where we attack it. Whatever exhibits C structure is dependent. What we're going to argue is no, God has an asymmetrical dependence. It's not a mutual dependence. So God doesn't exhibit a mutual dependence structure. God exhibits an asymmetrical dependence, where God, the divine substance, asymmetrically grounds his attributes, right? And so I don't think this argument, it's definitive. It's inconclusive, because with contemporary metaphysics, we can have divine aseity and deny divine simplicity. All right. So with that said, the Trinity, yeah, I still think that needed to be discussed further, and the Incarnation, it was discussed briefly at the end. And what Dr. Ortlund was arguing is, well, you have two substances, right? But here's the problem. If you take hylomorphism, like Thomas Aquinas, then a complete person is you have the substance and the form, or I should say the form and the matter, right? So the form would be the divine person, the divine logos, which is a substance, right? But that's what's so weird. The substance is taken as, because it seems like the hypostatic union, we are using and articulating that in terms of Cartesian dualism, where you have two substances, right? Whereas when we talk about hylomorphism, we're taking more of a part whole. We're using Mariology. And so we have to make that straight, keep that straight. Are we taking the divine Son as a part within a whole? Or are we taking the divine Son as a substance, right? The person within the divine substance as a part of the, of the Incarnation, right? And so it's like substance, part, right? So we need to be clear. So are we dealing with Cartesian dualism here, or are we dealing with some sort of hylomorphism? And if we're dealing with hylomorphism, this is why some would say that the Incarnation, we have to get rid of a compositional Christology, because, you know, the assumptions of Chalcedon is some sort of substance attribute distinction, whereas the articulation from Aquinas and others is more of a part whole distinction, right? Where you have Mariology and you have some sort of hylomorphism. And so that's where we need to get more precision on in articulating the Incarnation. And then I know Tim Paul, he has some good work trying to articulate the more conciliar tradition on the Incarnation. But I still think that it's going to be hard to understand how divine simplicity works with a conciliar Christology that affirms the claims of the Fourth Lateran Council and the claims of Chalcedon, and yet affirm divine simplicity. It's going to be hard to articulate that. But hey, I'm interested to hear more about that, right? But yeah, so that's going to be my initial reactions. I don't think the debate was very, it wasn't what I anticipated it was going to be. I thought there was going to be more to the arguments, like more in-depth discussion. But then again, you only have 30 minutes, so it's just not going to be adequate time to get into the details of it. Well, I hope my discussion here was profitable. And again, look into the work that I've discussed, and I just pray that this would be a blessing. If you want more resources, ask questions in the comments. Peace and God bless.